Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on the Power to the Flower podcast. My name is Nairobi Sanchez, and I am your host. And welcome to episode 9. On this episode titled, Pardon Me, the Policies of Pop Pardons, we will be discussing the procedures of getting pardons for cannabis-related offenses. Now, most people don't realize that these pardons are done through executive order, contrary to what could be like record sealing or expungements that could be passed through laws. This is a little bit different. A pardon can be given through and only guaranteed by the clemency powers of an executive office holder. So in the state and on the federal levels, we both have 3 branches of government, and 2 of those positions on the executive levels for both state and the federal level are the governor and the president. On this episode, I'm going to be talking about the policies of pardons along with how pardons are enacted, where these pardons for cannabis-related offenses exist in the United States, and where we can actually do more for people beyond just pardons. Right now, there are a couple definitions that are thrown around a lot in the cannabis industry when it comes to the war on drugs and the impacts that we can have legally onto folks to positively change their lives. One of the ways that we could do that is not only via pardons, but also through expungement and through court sealing. I'm going to walk you through each state that decided to not only just pardon those folks with cannabis-related offenses, but also to expunge or to automatically seal or automatically expunge cannabis-related offenses that are small misdemeanors or misdemeanors with convictions, depending on the type of level of the offense. Each state has responded differently. Some of these offenses can go up to specific ounce amounts or specific amounts in the measurements of limits of which they could be pardoned. Others decided that maybe they wanted to go back farther in time to the time that the war on drugs was actually happening. And that's how it was decided how far back they want to go with regards to the records they wish to choose to seal and expunge. So record sealing is defined as hiding the criminal record from public view. But unfortunately, in this definition, record sealing does not take away that record or expunge it, is what we would call. The definition of expungement, however, is to completely not just remove it from public view, but to completely remove off the criminal record the misdemeanor or the offense that was once placed there. So when you're talking about record sealing versus expunging, you're understanding that the record that is sealed is still visible to some degree, meaning that even though it's sealed from public view, it is still on your record as an item in front of the courts, right? So I can't just go ahead and get access to your records if I pull it and you have your record sealed. I can't see what specifically you have on your record, but a judge can. And if you were to get it fully expunged, then it just wouldn't be on your record at all. So I wouldn't be able to see it. A judge wouldn't be able to see it, right? So these type of things are different and transformative depending on the case. And, sometimes having your record sealed is just enough. Other times it's not. Some people may want to go further completely and get it completely expunged from the record so that not only is it not accessible to public view, but also to private view in the eyes of the law or specifically in the courtroom. The definition of a pardon, however, is the official forgiveness of a crime, and that is done usually through executive order. Executive orders are done as a way of a signing of a law or a proclamation, something that specifically in document says on behalf of the executive branch powers. So we got to think about, again, we talked about this before, who sits in the executive branch. And we know that there are 3 branches of government. We have the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. These 3 branches are representative of the democratic government that exists not just in the United States, but in also each individual state and individual communities that are smaller municipalities and things like that. So within the executive branch of the federal government, you have the president. Within the executive branch of the state government, you have a governor. okay? The legislative branch and the executive branch. And of course, those who interpret these laws that are enacted and created by the legislative branch and the executive branch are the judicial branch members. So anybody in the judicial branch, these are the folks that are in the law or in the courtroom of what we are talking about, and oftentimes are the ones who can prosecute, the ones who are in going to prison, or specifically folks who are going into the court system to get their records expunged, are having to be faced with those in the judicial system. And the way that our government works is we have something called a checks and balances system. So the checks and balances is supposed to allow for one branch of the government to have a specific power while the other can check that power and balance it out with their own individual powers that would allow for it to be a equilibrious sort of relationship between the three powers. What I mean by that is when the executive branch, or in this case, and we're going to talk about in the case of states, when the executive branch makes a decision, the legislative branch can either create a law that is complementary to it, or it can shut that executive order down, right, by creating a law. Either way, that does have to get passed through the executive branch anyway to be signed into law, even though there is a majority of senators and representatives or assembly folks and senators in that number overall in the state government. However, when the judicial branch decides to interpret these laws, what they are looking at is the Constitution and determining on a case-by-case basis whether or not that case or the request going before the judicial branch or before the justice system is actually constitutional. So in plain terms, we're talking about requesting for expungement and requesting for query sealing. The way that it has been done so in the past, if the state has allowed through legislative powers, right, in a law, if the state legislators have signed into law that it is legal to be able to ask for expungement and record sealing under specific parameters of your misdemeanor or of your crime, then you may be eligible to get that sealed or get that expunged, but that would be under the jurisdiction of the judicial branch to interpret which is actually permissible. What happens in these cases, though, without a pardon, you're not necessarily getting an excuse. You have to go through the judicial branch to be able to interpret whether or not you can actually be eligible. So even if you are eligible for these things, the judge can decide and say no for whatever reason. And of course, that is the interpretation of the judicial branch in your case. What this does, when a judge decides to determine your case and say, you know, this may or may not be permissible, you then start to get disparities between those who go in front of one judge versus another judge who's more lenient. And we've seen this time and time again. That's why whenever somebody's going up in for a case or in for trial, the question is, who is your judge? Because that judge can actually be a little bit more lenient depending on their own personal interpretations of the law and how they feel about the law. And they may actually be the contrary, right? They may be a little bit more stricter on how they interpret the law. And then that then in turn impacts your penalties, right? So it can actually be a little bit tricky. So the antidote to this on the executive branch, because remember, it's a checks and balance systems, is by doing pardons. And so in the executive branch powers, the executive branch does have powers of clemency. This means that they can pardon specific crimes under specific jurisdictions that they so wish and desire, right? Every state is a little bit different in terms of what is actually eligible for clemency, but for the most part, the executive branch power does have the determining hand on who they choose to pardon, right? So there was a little bit of a in different states, there was a little bit of some sort of tension. And I say this because when you interpret the law in one way and execute it in another way, it does make it a little bit confusing and unfair for certain folks in the public that are going through this legal process to try to get their records expunged or sealed. And so the executive branch can decide that through executive order and do a sweep of reforms to many individuals if they so choose to. And there are a couple states that have decided on a gubernatorial level, like specifically a governor who has decided to do executive pardons. And one of those states are, I'll just go ahead in chronological order. The state of Washington, not Washington, D.C. per se, but the state of Washington itself. The governor at the time in 2019, Governor Jay Inslee, decided that he was going to pardon simple marijuana possessions and those related crimes, okay? So the people who were eligible for those pardons were just a shy number of 3,500, okay? A little bit above or around that number. And what this did was it addressed past misdemeanor marijuana-related convictions. So we're talking about 2019 being the first state of doing that since the whole process of legalization has been in place. At the same time, states have gone a little bit further, like the state of California, still on the West Coast, right? The state of California had started doing expungements since as early as 2018 and have been able to, clear a lot of really great numbers of people's records, right? So we have almost like in California, 200,000, almost even more than that, I think, at this point, that have been eligible not only for that expungement, but through the process of automatic expungements and sealing and all of those things. California was really actually one of the largest and most leading states to be able to expunge or seal records. And while there is no pardons in the specific state of California related to cannabis-related offenses, their process of expungement makes it a wider reach and a more seamless process, especially when there is automatic expungement. So those are things to consider because it really does create a larger reach and impact. Automatic expungements for the process of qualifying convictions is also eligible, not just in California, but in Connecticut, in DC. I mentioned Washington earlier, but this is DC, the District of Columbia, Illinois, which is the state where Chicago is in. And if you think about those who are living in the state of Illinois and more specifically the city of Chicago, it is very diverse, and there were large impacts of those folks living from the war on drugs living in Chicago. So keeping that in mind, the Black population, it is a very large Black population that lives in Chicago, Hispanic population as well, even Asians. But we always know very well that those who are most impacted by the war on drugs are folks of color, and specifically Black folks. In Oregon, Governor Kate Brown, again in the West Coast, we talk about a lot of where the geographic changes do tend to happen. And of course, they happen in areas and places that cannabis is already legal, if not has a recreational or medical market, one of the two. But usually medical is where they start first. So in the state of Oregon, Governor Kate Brown did pardon over 40,000 possessions or simple possessions of cannabis related offenses. So this was in November of 2022, which addressed the historical impacts of cannabis criminalization. And this pardon applied electronically to those who were convicted in Oregon for possessions of 1 ounce or less of cannabis. So again, like I said, the ounces and the ounces are a symptom of the limits that are eligible for pardons, right? So if you did more than an ounce or you had more than an ounce in your possession in the state of Oregon, you may not qualify for this. So just keep that in mind. It always just depends on what you had on your possession. And this is also very specific to the pre-2016 cases, of which a person was over the age of 21, and that is because of legalization. So the pardon will remove more than actually 40,000. It'll remove 47,444 convictions for possession of small amounts of cannabis in their individual records. So that's really good. It also did remove and forgive more than 14 billion in associated fines and fees. That's huge. Okay, so that is a lot of money that was also forgiven in associated fines and fees that are gone along through the court system when, faced with any of these cannabis related offenses in the court of law. Governor Tom Wolf of Pennsylvania was also one of those governors that decided to pardon cannabis offenses by way of executive order as well. And those were for possession and small amounts of personal use of cannabis as well. So even if you were going to possess or use cannabis, like let's say a joint or something like that, and were convicted for it and had some sort of, marker on your record, whether it was a felony or a state conviction, this is one of the things that the state was also willing to pardon, the governor himself. And only just about 600 folks qualified under this. So although it wasn't a lot, there was still some impact that was made. And we're looking forward to see what else happens in Pennsylvania, specifically when it comes to providing social equity opportunities to those who were impacted by the war on drugs. So while it just started there, that did not end. And in Pennsylvania, I know that folks are looking forward to being able to expand that market into recreational opportunities for Black and brown folks as well. As I mentioned earlier, only the executive branch can provide a pardon to an individual who has committed a crime. This is a public forgiveness, and it's sometimes given by way of a certificate or something on the record for that person to also have on their records that says that they have been pardoned in the views of the state or the federal law. In the case of our executive branch leader, President Joe Biden, on the federal level, President Joe Biden in his State of the Union address asked governors to also do similar initiatives on the state level to be able to get rid of simple possessions of cannabis for folks on the state level. The governors that heeded to that call to action, I am proud to say, one of them included Governor Maura Healey of the state of Massachusetts. So Governor Maura Healey, like I talked about before in this podcast, was able to do a blanket pardon for folks who have had simple possessions and expanded that list from to similarly mirror what President Joe Biden was discussing on that level. So that was back in March of 2024 this year, and those were all misdemeanor marijuana possession convictions. And this comprehensive pardon was the deliberate attempt to remove barriers for those who were convicted of cannabis possession, cannabis use, and all of those things. And we really want to applaud folks who do that. So thank you again. As a Massachusetts constituent, I do want to thank Governor Maura Healey for doing that. And we know that these pardons don't go far enough, but we do want to recognize the work that is done from all of the members of our government, because it is a grand unified effort to be able to provide equity for the folks who have been harmed by the war on drugs. So thank you. And last but certainly not least, Governor Wes Moore of the state of Maryland has pardoned more than 175,000 misdemeanor marijuana-related offenses. Okay, this is huge. That is by far the largest number of individuals in any one state that have been pardoned for marijuana-related misdemeanor offenses. And this is, again, incredible work done by the state of Maryland, and specifically Wes Moore. And even more beautifully, that was done 2 days before Juneteenth, on June 17th. This is amazing, okay? This is what we call one of those sweeping legislations that directly impact people that were harmed by the war on drugs, and more specifically give credence to the Black community, which has been highly criminalized, and especially in states like Maryland, where the crime rates are disproportionately towards Black folks. Okay, so we want to be able to say thank you to these executive leaders who have done the good work and have been putting in the effort to not just pardon folks, but to do sweeping legislations, or have been supportive of legislations that have been supportive of legislation that has been instrumental to the community that has been harmed by the war on drugs, or those who are of their families and that are looking to enter into this space, whether by being an entrepreneur or, working in the industry in some capacity. So there is amazing work to be done and still continue to be done, especially now that we see that there's federal interest to be able to do so. So while we are still trying to make changes on the federal level, it is clear and apparent that on the state level, there is a lot of work that still can be done, not just by executive pardons, but expanding that list that we mentioned earlier of those states that also include expungements in their options for record sealing. So again, I just want to list out the states that do have automatic expungement for the process of qualifying specific qualifying conditions. So automatic expungement states, again, are the states of California, Connecticut, the District of Columbia, which is not a state, but the state of Illinois, the state of Minnesota, Missouri, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Rhode Island, USVI, or the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is not a state but a territory, and Vermont. So these are the states that do automatic expungement. If your state is not on this list, you may still want to be able to see if your state does do expungements anyway. The states that don't do automatic expungement but do expunge records are Arizona, Colorado, Delaware, Hawaii, Louisiana, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Oregon, and Washington. Again, not automatic, but expungements are still had. And there are just, there's just one state that specifically does have an expungement process, but again, is an annulment. There's an annulment process for available offenders, available for certain offenders. So specifically, the state of New Hampshire is that state that allows for annulment processes to be available for certain offenses and offenders, okay? And in states where certain marijuana-related convictions may be sealed, we have the state of Virginia. So it's certain related offenses that may be sealed, not all. Those states that have certain convictions that may be eligible for unconditional pardons from a state advisory board, which we talked about before, could be like the Bureau of Pardons or the Board of Pardons, could even be the Governor's Council, and that state is the state of North Dakota. Okay, so all of the other states that I did mention, there is a significant amount throughout the whole United States that do care about expunging or sealing records. And obviously the best of every case scenario is to have automatic expungements, because this leads people to not have to go through the judicial process to even file paperwork or even through any portals. All they have to do is just be themselves and still have that same record. By way of automatic expungement, the state takes on that system and then does the expungement process on the back end. So it would clear those records without having to go in person for that one individual to clear the record, or even to have to go before a judge. As we talked about before, with judicial interpretations, sometimes this leads for unfair or very biased results and outcomes for the people that are looking to get the record sealed or expunged. So in summary, there's a lot of really great initiatives being had on this level, but it's really important that we understand the difference between pardons and the difference between any other sort of initiatives like expungements or sealing. Okay, so we also know that there are initiatives throughout the United States. Specifically, I'm talking about the clean slate bills that are going on through the whole 50 states that are pushing for record sealing and record expungements of records that are, of varying different types. It's not just related to cannabis offenses, though the most recent of those efforts that have been successful are the Maryland clean slate most recent executive pardons from the Governor Moore. So again, very, very great and good things happening in the community. And we want to continue to push that advocacy piece. So if your state was not listed on any of that, any of the lists that we talked about there, if your state is one of those states that just is not friendly to cannabis, and you're just hoping on federal legalization to change your environment and your reality, then I highly recommend that you reach out to me so that we could talk about how you can push for advocacy in your state. But if you are unable to reach me and you still would like to know, here are some just basic tips on what to do if your state is not on this list for pardons. So the first piece of advice is to reach out to your governor. I know that's very obvious, but the governor is the one that can provide for an executive pardon, not just for you, but for folks like you. If you are one of the folks that was listening to this list and you're like, why isn't my state included? Well, chances are somebody else in your state is looking for that same relief. So if you could find those same people, maybe there's advocacy groups on a local level, maybe there's leaders who have been trying to push for legalization, even recreationally in that state. Anybody who has been supportive of cannabis in your state, you might want to align with, or more specifically, groups and advocacy individuals who are very supportive of clean slate initiatives. So there might be one there. You can also check the clean slate initiative and click your state, see if there's a local organizer that could be, not just useful for you, but you could be useful to them with sharing your story, and getting in touch with the governor by way of an organization could also add to the case that you have there. So rule number one, reach out to your governor and ask, I would like for you to pardon people that are like me. I would like for you to pardon people that have had simple possessions of cannabis or have had misdemeanors on cannabis related offenses or cannabis related convictions. So you can do that. And you can also do number two, the second piece, reach out to your legislators to do the same thing. And what we can tell them is, right, and you can do this by reaching out via email. You can call their offices. You can reach out to their staff members. You can see them in public events. You can go even to their campaign emails and reaching out to their campaign and asking the simple question, would the legislature be able to pass this, bill that would pardon simple possessions, or sorry, not pardons, that would get rid of simple possessions of cannabis on records, right? So things like that. You can talk to your legislature and their representatives and ask them to support you and the initiatives that you're asking for the governor to sign or to make an executive order on. Number three, make sure that you know exactly the type of negative impacts that occur with having this on your record. And you may even not even think about it because you've had it for so long, but start to list out the ways in which that impacts you. And then when you can list that out, so if you say it's housing, it's job stability, it's, the ability to, be a coach for volunteer, volunteer at your school, your child's school or something like that. Even in scenarios like that, if it's really difficult for you to be able to do certain things because of what's on your record related to cannabis, then you certainly want to talk to your legislators and your governors to be able to understand those stories. But you want to list them out because you can also create strategic partnerships with people who are aligned in those overlapping intersectional topics. What I mean by that is you can find an advocacy group, like I mentioned before, in housing that can actually say, hey, we agree that this is a barrier for people to be able to own a home or to even get an apartment, right? Another piece is for jobs, right? So there are always workforce development groups and organizations that are looking to provide jobs, especially to people in communities of color. So there's a mutual beneficial interest to be able to clear records so that people can get jobs. So you might want to even team up with those type of local organizations to put and apply pressure onto your executive branch or your legislative branch, or even more so just in general, your leaders in the local level. local, state level, and even on the federal level. So just finding those allies will be stronger for you. And if you have any questions on who they are in your state and you want to ask me directly, feel free to. You can reach out to me at Power to the Flower Pod on Instagram, and I'll be able to answer your questions. That was it. Again, we have done a lot of really great work in the nation to be able to pardon folks and the records, but there's still a lot of more work to do. And more specifically, we need to expand and consider expanding the list, not just to simple possessions, but thinking about even distribution, those folks who would be likened to a dispensary right now in the legal market, and thinking about what opportunities exist in the legal market that the legacy market could really benefit from, especially if we were to pardon or expunge these records. So policies do have to be in line, not just with, criminal justice reform, but we also have to think about it on an economic level as well. What type of business opportunities can come from this now that there is already an existing industry? So that is my wrap. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I really appreciate you tuning in. If you guys have any questions, you know where to reach me. Thank you. Bye.